Hello again. We are back to continue perfect competition. We will continue to look at temporary shutdown decisions in 3 graphs. It's easier to see these in 3 graphs where the marginal revenue is at the minimum of the average variable cost, where the marginal revenue is less than the minimum of the average variable cost, and where it's above the average variable cost. Right, so we'll start with that and we'll end with tracing each firm's supply curve. Okay, let's jump in. So just looking at the first case, marginal revenue is at the minimum of the average variable cost. Remember, we first want to look at the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the marginal revenue curve, right? We see where they intersect. Let's call that point A. That gives us the profit maximizing quantity for the perfectly competitive single firm. Now, let's have the average variable cost curve. Let's have the minimum point sitting at A. When we have this, well, this point A becomes then the shutdown point. At point A, this firm's behavior would be indifference between exiting, producing zero and paying only fixed cost, or staying to produce Q star and pay fixed cost. Now, remember, there's a previous video where I showed you how to visualize costs on this graph. Well, we are not going to do something too different from that. I can extend this intersection point between marginal cost and marginal revenue. I can extend it to touch the average variable cost. Oh, look, it's actually already touching it. And so I read that off as dollar value AVC. This tells me that my total revenue, right, which is from 0 to Q star to A to PE back to 0, my total revenue is exactly enough to cover my variable costs. My variable cost area goes from 0 to Q star to A to dollar value average variable cost back to 0. You see? And so, okay, what about the rest of the costs, right? Again, I'm just going to extend that point of intersection between marginal revenue and marginal cost to touch the average total cost curve, and I'm going to read that off. Dollar value average total cost. And from here, it's easy to see that the gap between average total cost and average variable cost is my average fixed cost. When I multiply it by Q star, I will get fixed cost. And so I can shade this, the fixed cost, in yellow. Now, this particular firm, which has the minimum of the average variable cost occurring exactly where marginal cost intersects with marginal revenue, that firm will be indifferent between exiting to produce 0 and then pay fixed cost, or staying to produce Q star and pay fixed cost. The reason that the firm is indifferent is that either way, the firm has to pay fixed cost, right? The extra cost the firm has to pay is fixed cost. What do I mean by the extra cost? Remember, your total revenue is your sales that are coming in. And out of your total revenue, you want to subtract your total cost to get your profit, right? Profit, I'm going to write that as pi, is calculated as total revenue minus total cost. So the whole time, what I have been doing is trying to figure out how much profit we will have. In this case, we are going to have negative profits in the sense that, well, total revenue minus total cost is variable cost plus fixed cost, right? Total revenue minus variable cost minus fixed cost. In this case, our total revenue is equal to our variable cost. And so we are able to cover all of our variable costs. So now our profit will be equal to negative fixed cost. We need to find some extra money, right, or financial capital somewhere to cover all of the to cover our fixed costs. And that is what I have shaded out here in yellow. So just to put I'm going to put an arrow on there to show that these are fixed costs, that we need to get some additional financial capital somewhere to cover it. All of our sales can only cover our variable costs. Again, variable costs would be, say, cost of our labor, right? So we can pay all of our workers, but we can't pay rent for our factory, right? So this is an example of that. So the other observation in here is that the total revenue can cover all of our variable costs, and we are left with fixed costs. So if the firm stays and produces Q star, they will be able to pay all of their workers, but then they can't pay rent. So fixed costs, example, rent on the factory, right? What if the firm exits? If the firm exits, say the firm is leasing the firm is leasing the factory from a landlord, right? Whether the firm is producing or not, the landlord still needs to be paid at the end of the month. And so, well, in that case, even if the firm produces zero, they'll still have to pay rent. They do get rid of their workers if they produce zero, right? So they won't have to pay workers, but they will have to pay rent because maybe you're on contract for the factory. You see? Okay, great. So when marginal revenue is at the minimum of the average variable cost, the firm is indifferent between exiting to produce zero and staying to produce Q star. And the reason for that indifference is either way, the firm pays fixed costs. Great. Okay. By the way, these three graphs that we are looking at will help us come up with how to trace the short run supply curve for each firm in perfect competition. Let's move on to the second graph. In the second graph, we have our Q star, right? The Q star is occurring where marginal cost is intersecting marginal revenue. So the first thing that we do is to get Q star. If we don't do that, we can't figure out what the costs are. Okay, so we get our Q star, and Q star is the profit maximizing quantity for the perfectly competitive firm. Okay, we get our Q star, we extend that intersection to touch our average variable cost, and we will label that as the dollar value of average variable cost. We do the same, we touch the average variable cost, dollar value, average total cost curve, dollar value, average total cost. Okay, what do you observe? This shaded area in black, this dotted area in black is your total revenue, your sales. It's not enough to cover your variable costs. This means you will not be able to pay some of your labor, and that's not a good thing, right? Now, whenever the firm is experiencing marginal revenue below the minimum of their variable cost, the firm's behavior would be to exit, produce zero, and pay only fixed costs. Why? The reason is, if this firm continues to operate, well, they will have an economic loss that is bigger than fixed costs. And what would that be? Well, they'll have to figure out how to pay, and I will shade what I'm going to show you in green. They'll figure out how to pay this much in variable cost. Remember, variable cost goes from 0 to Q star to B to AVC and down to 0. That is all of your variable costs, but your sales have been able to cover a good portion of it, right? Your sales, 0 to Q star to A to PE down to zero, that is your sales, or that's your total revenue. Total revenue is only enough to cover a portion of variable, a big portion though, of variable cost. But then you have to figure out how to cover the remaining shaded area, right? The remaining variable cost that I have shaded in green here. And you also have to figure out how to pay this yellow shaded area fixed cost. So this yellow shaded area is fixed cost. And the green shaded area is portion, right? It's just a small portion of variable costs. Now it's small based on how I've drawn it, right? So how about I just say portion of variable costs. Oops. There we go. Portion of variable costs. So if this firm decides to stay, they will not be able to cover all of their variable costs. They'll be left with that green area to figure out. And they'll be left with a fixed cost to figure out. So the total economic loss for this firm, if it operates, it will be fixed cost plus a portion of variable cost. So why should this firm exit? When the firm exits, it only has to pay fixed costs. But when the firm stays, when marginal revenue is below the minimum of average variable costs and the firm stays, then they will have to figure out how to pay that portion of variable costs plus fixed costs. That's a bigger loss if they stay. And so the behavior here is exit, abandon ship, and pay only fixed costs. You see, this also helps us to figure out supply. Whenever marginal revenue is below the minimum of average variable cost, the firm needs to produce zero. Do you see? Okay, let's move on to the next one. This is the third and final graph for the temporary shutdown decisions a firm has to consider, right? Here we have marginal revenue above the minimum of the average variable cost. But first, what we need to do is take a look at the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue and get your profit maximizing quantity Q star. You see? And then you extend the line, you extend a line vertically from that intersection. You touch the average variable cost and you record it as dollar value average variable cost. Again, extend the line or extend a vertical line from the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue, touch the average total cost, and read it off and label it dollar value average total cost. Oh, hey, this is a bit different, right? Because if you notice, I'm going to shade in green variable costs. Variable cost is this green shaded area. And then I will shade in red. I'll put red dots where we have our total revenue. Red dots where we have our total revenue. So our sales that are coming in more than cover our variable cost, right? So red dots are total revenue and the green shaded area, the green shaded area will be variable cost. Okay, sweet. You can observe that total revenue can cover all of our variable costs and parts of our fixed cost. Fixed cost will be the distance from ATC to AVC, right? That is average fixed cost times average fixed cost times Q star will give us all of fixed cost. So let me do this in yellow. That way, let me get rid of this for now and I'll do it in yellow. All right, so this is my average fixed cost average fixed cost, AFC times Q star will give us fixed cost. Now I'm going to shade fixed cost in yellow. I know that this is getting busy, but bear with me here. And so I'm going to write that up here. This is our fixed cost. Give you a nice little legend, eh? This is our fixed cost in yellow. So you can see that the red dots, which indicates our total revenue, can also cover a part, a nice part, right? A good part of our fixed costs. So what should the firm do? The firm can stay and produce Q star and pay an economic loss that is less than fixed costs. So this is how I'm getting all of this information. Now, if you're taking this class, this is where all that information you're seeing in your class, right? This is where it's coming from. Now, like I said earlier, these three graphs give us an idea of how we should trace each single firm. By the way, this graph is for a single firm, right? Single firm. This graph is for a single firm. All the graphs that we went through are for single firms under perfect competition. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go down here to tracing a single firm's short run supply curve. Now, children, whenever marginal revenue is below the minimum of the average variable cost, the firm should be indifferent between staying and exiting. The firm can produce zero. Scratch that. Whenever marginal revenue is below the minimum of the average variable cost, the firm should produce zero and exit. The firm should produce zero and exit. When marginal revenue is equal to the minimum of the average variable cost, the firm may produce zero or Q star. This is where the firm can be indifferent, right? When marginal revenue equals the minimum of average variable cost. But when marginal revenue is bigger than or is above the minimum of that average variable cost, the firm should produce Q star. How do we visualize this on this graph here for a single firm? Again, this graph is for a single firm. So let's take the one on the bottom. When marginal revenue is less than the minimum of the average variable cost, when marginal revenue is greater than the minimum of average variable cost, produce Q star. How do we show that? I'll show that in red and I'll make the line really thick. When marginal revenue is above the minimum of the average variable cost, produce Q star. So this thicker part of the marginal cost will be the short run supply curve when marginal revenue is above the minimum of the average variable cost. But what if marginal revenue is at the minimum of the average variable cost, like it is right here? Then we are saying the firm may produce Q star or zero. So I'll put a point right there and I'll put a point right here. That's what the second point gives us. Two dots, one here where it's zero, where Q star is zero, and one there where we have Q star, right? Now, what if marginal revenue is below the minimum of average variable cost? The firm needs to produce zero and exit, and so I will draw a thick line on this portion of the vertical axis and tell you that you see the thick lines in red. Those together give us the single firm's short run supply curve. That is pretty neat, isn't it? Okay, I really hope this helps you.